are actually doing a recorded-only version of this webinar due to technical difficulties we had during the May 1st webinar. We will also be doing a live version of the webinar on May 8th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. The purpose of this webinar is to give hospitals an overview of the new mhac methodology and to review the contents of reports that the HSCRC will be sending out to hospitals so that they can monitor their quality improvement. My name is Allison Schuster, and I am the Associate Director of Performance Measurement. The webinar agenda is as follows. We will first give an overview of the program and its guiding principles. We will then review the new methodology for measuring mhac performance and how that will impact hospitals financially. We will then walk through the mhac Excel workbook. We will discuss reporting timelines and show you how to use the calculation sheet. The mhac Excel workbook and the calculation sheet were recently sent out with the rate year 2016 mhac memo. So first I'll go through an overview of the program and its guiding principles. The mhac program uses a list of 65 potentially preventable complications that was developed by 3M. PPCs are defined as harmful events such as accidental laceration during a procedure or negative outcomes like hospital-acquired pneumonia that may result from the process of care and treatment rather than from a natural progression of underlying disease. In order to code PPCs accurately, the PPC logic relies on present on admission indicators in the claims or case mix data. The mhac program then is designed to link hospital payment to hospital performance by comparing the observed number of PPCs that a hospital has to the number of expected PPCs. So as you know, the mhac methodology was revised recently because of the new all-payer model that started on January 1st, 2014. The new methodology was actually proposed by the MHA and vetted by our Performance Measurement Work Group and HSCRC staff before being approved by the Commission in April. As the methodology was being developed, the following guiding principles were considered. First, the new program had to help Maryland achieve the new all-payer model goal of a 30% reduction in all 65 PPCs by the end of 2018. This is different than the previous program where not all 65 PPCs were included, and the previous program was more focused on the excess costs of each PPC rather than on the actual number. The new program also had to line up with other waiver requirements, such as the breadth and impact of the program had to meet or exceed the Medicare national program in terms of the measures and the amount of revenue at risk. It also had to improve care for all patients regardless of payer. The new program also was designed to prioritize PPCs that are high volume, high cost, have opportunity for improvement, and are areas of national focus. In addition, it had to have predetermined performance targets and financial impact. Again, this differs from the previous program where hospitals were ranked after the performance period to determine penalties, and thus they wouldn't know the financial impact until after the end of the year. We also wanted to encourage cooperation and the sharing of best practices among hospitals and hold hospitals harmless for lack of improvement if attainment is highly favorable. And finally, we wanted to give hospitals the ability to track their progress throughout the performance year. Now this slide compares the previous mhac program with the new mhac program. I'm not going to walk through it in detail. However, as I just mentioned, there are some differences. For instance, the performance metric. In the old program, the performance metric was excess cost of PPCs over the total revenue at risk. And in the new program, the performance metric is the observed to expected ratio. As a reminder, this webinar is related to rate year 2016. So that means that the base period is going to be calendar year 2013, and the performance period will be the base period will be calendar year 2013, and the base period will be calendar year 2014. The base period will be used to establish the benchmarks and thresholds, the scaling, and, of course, improvement targets. The performance period will then be used to rate performance that will then impact fiscal year 2016 hospital rates. So next I'm going to review the new methodology for mhac performance scoring. I'm going to walk through the various components here of the measurement methodology. And as I go through the presentation, you will note that I will mention where specific information is contained in the mhac Excel workbook that was sent out with the recent mhac memo. However, after we've gone through the methodology, I will open up the Excel workbook and walk through the tabs in detail. Again, hospital performance in the new program is measured with the observed to expected ratio for each PPC. In order to calculate the expected numbers, we use norms from calendar year 2013 that were calculated by APR, DRG, and severity of illness level. Now, this isn't changed from the previous program. However, if there are questions about how the expected numbers are calculated, you should feel free to contact us. You can also see here in the blue box that we have posted these norms on the HSCRC website, and they are included in tab 5 of the Excel workbook. So in order to make the measurement fair and stable, there are certain adjustments or exclusions that are applied to the base period. For calendar year 2013 base period, for each hospital, cases are removed if the APR DRG SOI cell has less than 2 total cases, if the case is a palliative care case, and if the case has more than 6 PPCs. And these are generally considered catastrophic cases and are generally outliers. Now, these case level removal is the same as it has been in the previous program. However, in addition, in the new mhac methodology, we are also removing PPCs if, for a hospital, for a specific PPC, they have the number of cases at risk that is less than 10, or the number of expected cases is less than 1. It should be noted that these adjustments only apply to the base period and not to the calendar year 2014 performance period. And this was done so that scores can be calculated during the performance year prior to knowing whether these exclusions should be applied. Now, because certain PPCs will be excluded, this means that not all hospitals will be measured on all 65 PPCs. In order to know which PPCs are included for your hospital, we have provided an excluded PPC list. So this is a sample of what the excluded PPC list looks like. What it shows us, for example, is that for Meredith, they have 4 excluded PPCs. That's PPC 12, 26, 43, and 63. This means, again, that they either had less than 10 at-risk cases expected, or they had, less than 10 cases at risk, or they had less than 1 expected. It should be noted that hospitals with no excluded PPCs do not appear on this list. So the new methodology uses benchmarks and thresholds to assign points to hospitals for each PPC. This is similar to the way that the Maryland QBR and the Medicare VBP program work. The threshold and benchmark value is calculated using the 2013 base period data. It should be noted as well, though, that we have defined some PPCs as serious reportable events, and the threshold and benchmark for those are 0. These are listed here. There are 5 of them, and these were determined in collaboration with stakeholders, and they may change over time. For all other PPCs, the threshold is the weighted mean of all observed to expected ratios, which actually equals 1, and the benchmark is the weighted mean of the top quartile of the OE ratio. Now this slide shows a snapshot of the benchmark and threshold report. On the next slide, I'm going to walk you through how these are used to calculate points. But as you can see, this report shows us that for PPC 1, which is stroke and intracranial hemorrhage, the threshold is 1, and the benchmark is 0.6026. Also, I want to point out that I put PPC 30 on here. This is one of the serious reportable events, and again, you can see the threshold and the benchmark are 0. So once you know the threshold and benchmark, you can now calculate attainment and improvement points. This is done by comparing a hospital's observed to expected ratio to see whether it is higher or lower than the threshold and benchmark for attainment, or whether it is higher or lower than the previous year's performance for improvement. For each PPC, the maximum number of points that you can get is 10. This is 10. And as with the QBR program, the final points for each PPC are based on the higher of attainment or improvement. So for attainment, the number of points a hospital will receive is based upon the range between the benchmark and the threshold. Hospitals whose performance period rates are equal to or above the benchmark receive 10 full attainment points, and hospitals whose rates are below the threshold receive 0 attainment points. I will, on the next slide, show you the formula for calculating partial points between 0 and 10. While for calculating improvement points, that is based upon a scale between the hospital's base period performance on a particular PPC and the benchmark. This means if the performance rate is equal to or above the benchmark, they receive their full improvement points, but hospitals whose rates are equal to or below their base period rate receive 0 improvement points. So this slide shows the formulas for how to calculate partial points when the hospital's performance is higher than the threshold or base period, but lower than the benchmark. I will tell you that we do provide a calculation sheet with these formulas embedded. However, they're here in case you need them for your reference. So as mentioned earlier in the guiding principles, the new mhac methodology was designed to have a way to weight PPCs differently so that more emphasis would be put on what we are calling the target PPCs, since reducing these will contribute more to achieving the waiver goal of a 30% reduction by 2018. So we established 3 tiers. One is this target list, and these are high volume, high cost, and have an opportunity for improvement and are of national focus. Tier 2 are PPCs not on this target list, but ones that have a high percentage attributed to Medicare patients and that affect the majority of hospitals. Tier 3 are all other PPCs, including those with very low volume, those that affect a low number of hospitals, and obstetric-related PPCs. So for each tier, they are weighted differently. Tier 1 is weighted at 100%, Tier 2 is weighted at 60%, and Tier 3 is weighted at 40%. There are 20 PPCs in Tier 1, 9 in Tier 2, and 36 in Tier 3. Again, these tiers and which PPCs appear in each tier was decided in conjunction with stakeholders, and the list of these PPCs and which tier they fall into are available in the appendix of the approved commissioner recommendations. So this slide tells you how to calculate a hospital's final score. So what you do is you essentially take the points for all PPCs in Tier 1, you times that by 1, because this is, again, weighted at 100%, and you divide that by the number of possible points in Tier 1, or the denominator, and you again multiply that by the weighting, which is 1%. So in this case, there are 20 PPCs in Tier 1, so the denominator, or the possible number of points, is 200, 20 times 10, the maximum number of points for each PPC. You then calculate this percent for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and you sum them together so that you will get the final mhac score for your hospital. Again, I'm going to show you this when we walk through the Excel workbook, and also this formula is embedded in the calculation sheet. So now that you've been shown how to calculate a final score for your hospital, how do you determine the financial impact of that score, or the potential financial impact? So for rate year 2016, the Commission voted for the following scaling parameters. First, they set for calendar year 2014 a statewide mhac minimum improvement target of 8%. If this 8% reduction target is not met, the maximum revenue at risk will be 4% of permanent inpatient revenue. If the 8% reduction target is exceeded, the maximum revenue at risk will be 1% of permanent inpatient revenue, and there will be rewards to hospitals with a score of greater than 0.6 up to 1% of permanent inpatient revenue, provided sufficient funds are collected through penalties. There is also a maximum statewide total penalty limit of 0.5% of permanent inpatient revenue. What this means is that if many hospitals do badly and there's a large amount of revenue that could be collected in penalties, the actual total amount collected will not exceed 0.5% of the total inpatient revenue for the state. This will be done by adjusting each hospital's penalty by a certain amount. So to actually figure out the percent of revenue at risk based upon that final mhac score, we use a scale that was calculated using the base period attainment points. And I'm going to show you a snapshot of this on the next slide. The scale is a continuous range from the base period's minimum score to the maximum score. Now, there are actually two scales. One is for if we exceed that 8% target, and one is if we do not exceed that. Okay, so I know this snapshot here is small, but what I wanted to show you is that there are two columns. One is for if we do not achieve the minimum target, and the other one is if we exceed that minimum target. And what this scale does is it allows hospitals to see what percent of revenue would be in penalties or rewards based upon a certain final score. So, for instance, if your hospital's final mhac score was 0.17 or less, your penalty or your revenue that would be reduced is either 4% or 1%. That's the maximum penalty. However, these amounts are reduced as your score goes up, and when you hit the penalty threshold, the amount of revenue at risk is 0%. So what, again, this means is if your score is above 0.5 and we do not hit the 8% minimum target, you still will have 0% of your revenue at risk. Excuse me, I clicked on the slide. In addition, if we do meet the target of 8% reduction, there will be rewards, and those are shown here, and the percentage amounts are shown here in the green section. Now, again, these scales have different thresholds and are designed to incentivize quality improvement and hospital collaboration. So, for instance, if a hospital scores 0.46 and we do not meet the 8% target as a state, their revenue would be reduced by 0.59%. But if we do, as a state, meet the target, their revenue would actually not be reduced at all. And then again, as I said before, there would be rewards. So if a hospital scores, let's say, 0.7, if the state as a whole doesn't meet the minimum quality target, they'll get 0% reduced. But if the state does meet the minimum target, then they would get 0.47% of a reward. So how are hospitals going to know as a state if we are on target for hitting the 8% reduction? So here's the calculation that is used to calculate the statewide mhac rate and the percent improvement in that rate. This percent improvement will be provided throughout the performance period in the Excel workbook, both for state and for each hospital. I will caution you, however, that the data that we are providing on a monthly basis is preliminary data, and hospitals are able to correct that data prior to the final quarterly submission. So again, the percent improvement at that time may not be the final percent improvement. Next, we're going to go through the mhac program reporting and calculation sheet. So all the CFOs, the mhac contacts, and case mix liaisons should have received this mhac memo with a mhac Excel workbook. This workbook is not posted online because the current sheet only has preliminary reports using January and February 2014 data. In the Excel file, there are 4 permanent sheets, or sheets that contain the base year information, and there are 3 sheets that are based upon the calendar year 2014 performance period. And these will give you the hospital performance results as of that period, their final scores, and that statewide improvement. Now, in addition, in addition to walking through this workbook, I will then come back and tell you about the reporting and when you should receive this workbook. So this is the mhac permanent and detailed tables workbook that was sent out with January and February data. On tab 1, you have the cover sheet that just gives you information again on which rate year, which performance, base year and performance year, and what version of software we're using, as well as it tells you what is included in this workbook. So if you go to tab 2, this I already showed you a picture of, but this tab contains the thresholds and benchmarks for each of the PPCs. Tab 3 shows you the scaling for penalties and rewards based upon the final mhac score. So again, you can use this sheet to say, okay, if I score 0.3, what will be the amount of revenue that will be reduced for my hospital? Next is the excluded PPCs list, which I already showed you. And finally, this is the norm sheet that I mentioned. This is a sheet hospitals have received previously, and this sheet allows you to try to calculate how many people are expected to be at risk for each PPC. So what this does is it tells you by APR-DRG severity of illness level. So for instance, for APR-DRG 4, severity of illness level 3, it tells you that 11.11% of at-risk cases are expected to have this PPC. Again, you can use this then to make estimates for your expected numbers to try to monitor performance throughout the performance year. So this next tab is probably what you're most interested in, because these are the results based upon the preliminary January and February data. So what this sheet shows us, first it gives us the hospital, in column A and B, it gives us the hospital information. In column C and D, it gives us the PPC number and description. Column E tells you which tier the PPC falls into. So for instance, PPC 1 falls into tier 3, which means it will only be weighted at 40%. These next two columns show you the threshold and the benchmark. And again, these are calculated based upon the calendar year 2013 base period. These next four columns, which I'm going to go ahead and highlight in yellow, are actually your base year information. So this is telling you how many people were at risk for PPC1, how many observed cases you had, how many expected, and then your observed to expected ratio. These next four columns are, and I'm going to highlight them here in light blue, are your data for January and February. Again, this is preliminary data. So what this shows us is that over that period of time, for PPC1, this hospital had 2,301 at-risk cases. As you can see, that's a lot lower than the 13,000 that they had during the entire calendar year of 2013. And again, that's because it's just the number they had during January and February. They also, you can see they had one PPC during that period. They were expected, just in January and February, to have 2.1 PPCs, so their OE ratio is 0.4660. So in order to calculate the unweighted achievement or attainment point, what you do is you compare this OE ratio of 0.4660 to the benchmark. And as you can see, it's lower than the benchmark, which means they did better. So they get 10 full achievement or attainment points. In addition, if you look at this value and you compare it to how they did last year, it's also lower than how they did in calendar year 2013, so they get the full 9 improvement points. This unweighted final points column takes, again, whichever is higher of achievement or improvement. Now, just to give a second example, this next PPC, as you can see, the OE ratio is 3.4. This is higher than the benchmark and higher than how the hospital did last year, and so they get 0 points. So once you have all of the points for each PPC, we then go ahead and calculate the final score. So this tab shows you the final score for each hospital. First, you have the hospital information. Then in tab C, it tells, in column C, it then tells you the total number of PPCs included for each hospital. Then for each tier, it shows you the number of points you achieved for all PPCs in that tier over the denominator. Again, so for Meredith, they had 20 PPCs in Tier 1, so the denominator is 20 times 10, or 200. However, as you can see here for Prince George's, they only have 19 PPCs included, so their denominator is 190. So you then do this for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And then we calculate it here, and the formula is included in the workbook. We calculate your final weighted points, or your numerator for your final score. So what we do there is we add up the total points you scored in Tier 1. We multiply that by 1 because that's weighted at 100%. We add up the points that you scored in Tier 2 and multiply that by 60%, and the total points in Tier 3 times 40%. We do the same thing for the denominator, and then here you can see the final score, weighted scores calculated. That is, the numerator divided by the denominator. They get a score of 0.73. You can then go back and look at the scaling sheet, and you can come down to 0.73, and you can see that this means that they'll either have a 0% penalty, or they may be eligible for a 0.63% reward. So again, how are you going to know whether or not we are, as a state as a whole, going to achieve that 8% minimum mhac improvement? This tab, the last tab in the workbook, is what will tell you this. It will tell you the rate of improvement for each hospital, as well as down here, and I'm just going to highlight this in orange, the statewide improvement. So again, these first four columns, or not the first four, these four columns contain the calendar year 2013 base period information. The second four columns include the preliminary data from January and February only. It shows us the total number of observed PPCs, the total number of expected, the ratio, and the risk-adjusted rate. So as you can see, we then calculate over here in column K the percent improvement. So for Meredith, they've actually had almost a 40% reduction in PPCs when you compare the first 2 months of this year with the last, with the entire calendar year 2013 base period. Now that's good because it's an improvement. However, when you look down here as a state as a whole, at this point, with only preliminary data, it looks like there's actually been a 2.62% increase in PPCs. Now again, this is preliminary, and hospitals do have the ability to go back in and correct this data prior to their quarterly final data submission. So next, I'm going back to the PowerPoint presentation. I just want to give you an overview of when you will get these reports. So starting in January of this year, hospitals began submitting preliminary monthly data around the 15th of every month. And they will be submitting final quarterly data around 60 days after the end of the quarter. So beginning with data submitted around May 15th, the HSCRC will provide preliminary monthly results within 28 days after the end of the month. This allows time after the 15th of the month for the data to be processed by our vendor and for us to run our programs. The preliminary data, though, for March has not yet been provided. However, we will be providing that early next week. In addition to providing the Excel workbook, you will also receive case-level reports, and these will allow hospitals to review cases and make any corrections with the data before submitting the final quarterly data. The final quarterly results, as well as the annual results, will then be sent out within 75 days after the end of the quarter. A calculation sheet has also been provided to allow hospitals that want to be able to monitor scores over time or to do estimates of what their final scores might be under different scenarios. So I'm going to now show you this calculation sheet. So this is the calculation sheet that we sent out. This is the calculation sheet we sent out. And as you can see, there is no information in the observed, expected, or at-risk columns. That is what you will fill in order for the calculation sheet to calculate your final scores. So this calculation sheet is actually divided so that each of the PPCs here that are in Tier 1 are on the top. Then as you scroll down, you'll see Tier 2. And then finally, the 36 PPCs included in Tier 3. Now, we have highlighted those that are serious reportable events, or what are sometimes also called never events, in yellow because the formulas for those that are embedded in the workbook are different. So again, what a hospital can do is they can go in and they can enter in their information from last year here in the observed, expected, and at-risk columns. And then they can enter in the observed, expected, and at-risk for the performance period. You could do this based off of the data we sent, or you could go ahead and try to calculate, or you could do other potential trending that you want to do to estimate what you think your observed, expected, and at-risk will be, so that then you can see what your score will be. Okay, so once you enter in the observed, expected, at-risk, and why don't I switch for a minute to show you one that's been filled in, the attainment and improvement points will be automatically calculated, as well as then the final total unweighted points. Now again, the formulas are embedded in the workbook, although you could delete them theoretically. So if you have any problems where you've modified your workbook, you can get a new copy of this on the HSCRC website. So then what you do is once you've entered in all the data, here in row 25, you'll see a subtotal for Tier 1. So this is, again, the total number of points for Tier 1 and the total denominator. Row 35, you'll see the subtotal for Tier 2. And as you scroll down, then you'll see the subtotal for Tier 3. Now, again, if your PPC is omitted because in the base year data you didn't have at least 10 at risk or 1 expected, those don't show up here. And finally, down here in yellow, you will see the calculated weighted score. So with that, I am going to just acknowledge again the help that we've had from the MHA and the hospital industry and other stakeholders for developing and proposing this new methodology. And I will end by saying if you have any questions, you should feel free to email us at hscrc.quality@maryland.gov. Again, this is a recorded only version of the webinar, so there is not a question and answer period. However, we will be repeating the webinar on May 8th from 2 to 3:30, and you can join us then if you'd like to ask questions on a live basis. Thank you. We appreciate your time.